In progress.
Good evening and welcome to the City Council special meeting. Is there a reverb?
Yeah. Sounds like you're announcing a rodeo.
Round two. Good evening and welcome to the City Council special meeting this Tuesday evening on January 24th. I now call this meeting to order. Madam Clerk, will you please call roll?
With pleasure, Mayor. Councilmember Hedges?
Here.
Councilmember Lorraine?
Here.
Councilmember Newsom?
Here.
Deputy Mayor Diaz-Nash?
Here.
Mayor Lee?
Here. We are excited to be here in person with options for those who choose not to be in person to participate virtually. There are several ways to participate. For those attending in person, complete a yellow request to speak slip and hand it to the clerk. If participating remotely, use the raise your hand feature in Zoom and you'll be called on at the appropriate time. If calling in via phone, press *9 to raise your hand, and when called upon, press *6 to unmute. These options for public comment will remain available until I close public comment period for each specific item. Our first item on the agenda for the study session is Human Trafficking Prevention Month Proclamation. Do we have? Wonderful. So we have Ruth Robinson from Sisters Against Slavery and a participant with the San Mateo County Human Trafficking Initiative. Welcome, Ms. Robinson.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor Lee and council members. My name is Ruth Robinson. I'm not a Catholic sister, but I work with a group of Catholic sisters that formed a coalition in 2008 to raise awareness on the issue of human trafficking. The coalition is currently working on a project to bring information on trafficking into the Catholic secondary schools in the Bay Area. In addition, among other activities, the coalition participates in the San Mateo County Human Trafficking Initiative. As I'm sure you know, trafficking is a crime that can take place in front of our eyes. Victims of labor trafficking can be found on construction sites, in restaurants, hotels, and nursing homes. Anyone seeking to improve their life can be vulnerable to trafficking. At the same time, the pandemic conditions of recent times have led to social isolation and increased vulnerability among the most marginalized in our communities. It is important that we all be aware of the circumstances that can result in human exploitation. For these reasons, I'm very grateful to you for your attention to this important issue. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you tonight. Thank you very much for your proclamation and for your efforts to raise awareness in San Mateo about the crime of human trafficking. The sisters and I appreciate it very much.
I'm so happy that you approached me with this initiative. I don't know if you know this, but actually when I was working in China at UNICEF, I was working on the ground in rural areas with a lot of labor camps, migrant labor camps, and one of the most serious and grave vulnerabilities of the migrant women was sex trafficking, and so I've worked on this issue in an international capacity, and also having served in the city, there were other times where where community members actually raised the flag and said, something doesn't feel right in this business. I'm worried, and actually that inspired some of really good policing and follow-up that resulted in some of those folks getting into services and getting out of the really really scary and dangerous situations. So it happens in front of us, and one of the antidotes is all of us being vigilant and speaking up for other people that when we see something that that doesn't look right or feel right. And so thank you for raising attention to this issue. I will read the proclamation for everyone's benefit. Whereas January is National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month, and January 11th is National Human Trafficking Awareness Day, and whereas the United States Senate designated January 11th as National Human Trafficking Awareness Day in 2007, and beginning in 2010 by presidential proclamation, each January has been designated as National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month. And whereas human trafficking involves commercial sex exploitation and labor exploitation, sex trafficking is defined as commercial sex act that is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. But if the person has not attained the age of 18 years old, force, fraud, or coercion is not required. Labor trafficking is defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjugation to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. Whereas human trafficking is a human rights violation and a violation of both federal and California law, it also promotes the breakdown of families and communities, fuels organized crime, deprives countries of human capital, undermines public health, and imposes large economic costs. Whereas the crime of human trafficking is present in every country and every US state. And whereas the FBI has identified California and the San Francisco Bay Area as an area of high prevalence for human trafficking, although human trafficking is illegal, victims often do not recognize their victimization, do not know that help is available, and where to seek assistance. And whereas forced labor, involuntary domestic servitude, and commercial sexual exploitation of adults and youth have been found to exist within local communities, and whereas public awareness about human trafficking still needs to reach broader communities and communicate more information about the nuances of this crime, and whereas the County of San Mateo has dedicated resources, including the County Human Trafficking Program, and has supported efforts of the County Police Chiefs, Sheriff Association, and partnered with governmental and non-governmental organizations to identify and address human trafficking within San Mateo County. Now, therefore, I, Amaranth Lee, Mayor of the City of San Mateo, on behalf of the City Council, do hereby proclaim January 2023 as Human Trafficking Prevention Month. So thank you so much for being here. We are with you and encourage all employers, officers, and residents to support the national and local fight against human trafficking.
Thank you, Mayor Lee.
And we will get the proclamation to you by mail.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care.
You too, thank you.
So we will begin with one item on tonight's agenda for the housing element. First, a note about public comment. We have received a lot of public comment on this item, and we know people feel very passionately about housing in San Mateo and the approach to provide housing. Please rest assured that we have read all of your comments and will take them into consideration in our deliberation tonight. As always, the rules of decorum apply to everyone who attends a meeting. These rules are provided to ensure that all members of the public have equal access to the democratic process, and so that all feel free to participate. We want to hear from everyone and all opinions. Respect and courtesy are required. That means no clapping, cheering, jeering, or booing will be tolerated, as it serves to keep some from feeling safe in commenting. And it makes my city clerk very upset. So please mind your manners in City Hall. We appreciate your help to have a productive conversation. And we will turn to our general plan amendment to adopt the City of San Mateo's housing element for 2023 and through 2031. We have a presentation from our housing manager, Eloisa Murillo Garcia.
And through the mayor, if I could add one quick note, this is a city council special meeting. There is no public comment on items not on the agenda at a special meeting. We're only taking comments on this particular item. I've had a couple questions, so I wanted to clarify that.
Thank you, Eloisa.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Mayor and honorable council members. As the mayor said, I'm Eloisa Murillo Garcia. I am the housing manager in the Community Development Department. With me tonight is Diana Elrod from Diana R. Elrod Consulting, as well as Zach Dahl, the Deputy Director from the CDD Department. And before I launch into the presentation, I just wanted to mention that this presentation, unfortunately, is a little bit content heavy. We'll try to get through it as quickly as we can, but we anticipate it'll take between 30 and 35 minutes. So just to give you a heads up, like I said, we'll try to get through it quicker, but.
Can I ask a question then? Does council prefer to wait until the end of the presentation, or do you want to have some pauses for questions along the way? Since it's such a dense and long presentation.
I can go with what everybody else wants, but I'm willing to wait till the end.
Okay, let's do that then.
Okay, thank you. As I mentioned, we have the three of us here tonight, but this has actually been a very much a team effort. So there has been a large team that has assisted in putting this together. So in addition to the three of us here, we also have our planning manager, Manira Sandier. We also would like to acknowledge our prior housing manager, Sandra Council. Julia Klein, our principal planner, Linda Lee, associate planner, Nikki Vu from the housing division, our consultants in addition to Diana. We have Nicholas Hamilton from the Good City Company, Root Policy, who assisted with the AFFH preparation, and the 21 Elements, which is the San Mateo County Planning Collaborative. Tonight's agenda is here before you. First, we'll give a brief housing element background, go through the draft housing element timeline and revisions, an overview of the site's inventory. We'll also discuss the revised draft housing element, as well as public comments that we've received thus far and some of the responses that we have as a result of the public comments. We'll discuss the Planning Commission recommendation and next steps, and after that, we'll have time for clarifying questions, public comment, and City Council deliberation and action. So I'll give a really brief overview of what the housing element is. It's a required element of the general plan, and like the other chapters of the general plan, it is the only chapter that requires certification by the state, the Department of Housing and Community Development, otherwise known as HCD. This draft that you have before you is for the 6th housing element cycle, which is an 8-year cycle that runs from 2023 to 2031. And as part of the housing element, there is a regional housing needs allocation. For the whole Bay Area, it's just over 441,000 units. The city of San Mateo's allocation is 7,015 units. And this slide here just shows you the breakdown by the various income levels of these 7,015 units. Next, we'll get into the draft housing element timeline, and as well as the main revisions that have been made. So the initial draft housing element was published on April 6th for a 30-day public comment period, which ran until May 6th. In April and May, There were 2 Planning Commission public hearings for the Planning Commission to review and provide input, and a City Council public hearing on May 23rd. After receiving public comments and going to the Planning Commission and City Council for public hearings, the housing element was then updated based on that feedback and was submitted to HCD on July 1st. And HCD, after the first submittal to HCD, they have a 90-day period to review and provide comment. So on September 28th, HCD provided their first review letter to the city. On November 7th, the City Council held a study session to go over the HCD comments and provide direction to city staff on how to proceed. And just a quick summary on the review letter. As many of you know, the review letter included 91 comments. Staff has provided, it has made revisions to the housing element based on those HCD comments. Each of those comments is listed in Attachment B, Exhibit 2 of your packet. So each comment is noted on there, numbered. It has a column for the city response, as well as the location of where you can find the changes within the housing element. Some of the main comment areas in the letter were regarding the affirmatively furthering fair housing plan, the constraints analysis, the goals, policies, and programs, as well as the sites inventory. And as previously mentioned, the housing element was presented to City Council on May 23rd of last year. And at that time, City Council provided direction for staff to proceed with submitting the draft housing element to HCD with some additions, which included to evaluate the minimum residential requirements in mixed-use zoning districts, to include the prioritization of senior housing, to include an evaluation of parking standards for sites near transit, and to explore ways to support nonprofits and faith-based organizations to produce affordable housing. At the November 7th study session, staff provided an overview of the HCD review letter, and council generally supported the staff draft responses that were presented. Council provided direction for staff to make revisions necessary to address the HCD comments and to prioritize submitting the updated housing element to HCD by the January 31st, 2023 deadline. Next, I'll just run through some of the key housing element revisions that were made as a result of the HCD comments. In terms of affirmatively furthering fair housing, Appendix D of the housing element has been updated to include more information on the city's history on development and the prioritization of contributing factors in the city. It provides more detail on fair housing, legal cases, and inquiries. It expands on data on changes in racial composition within the city. It includes an enhanced discussion of special needs groups, and it provides a greater analysis of racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty and racially concentrated areas of affluence. In terms of the revisions to the constraints analysis, more information on the city's land use controls was added, including information on which ones constrain or impact housing development. For identified constraints, those were linked to programs that address or reduce those constraints. It evaluated the R3 open space and design review constraints. This included an update to policies H1.8 and H1.9 accordingly. And another revision was to add additional information about the general plan update and how Measure Y will be addressed as part of the GPU adoption in 2023. There were some additional changes made to the goals, policies, and programs, which included updating and clarifying timelines for various programs. We moved up the implementation targets for various programs to occur earlier in the cycle, as was requested by HCD. We added 2 new policies to Goal H1, which is the production goal, and 1 new policy to Goal H4, which is promotion. Many of the policies and programs measures under all 5 goals were also revised to provide additional clarity, increase the commitment, and outline how they address identified constraints. On the housing sites inventory, more detail was included on pipeline projects, as well as a detailed narrative explaining each site individually, which also outlined the basis for the realistic capacity calculation. More information was provided on affordable housing projects in the pipeline and proposed on city land, including Kiko Crossing and Bespoke, which is the public parking lot adjacent to the Talbots building. In addition, there is updated narrative and methodology, updated methodology section for the development of non-vacant sites. Background information was added on the age and size of buildings demolished for recently entitled development, as well as existing versus allowable floor area. There are also detailed descriptions of existing uses and maximum redevelopment potential. And finally, a new policy to conduct outreach for owners on properties that are located on the site's inventory. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Diana.
Thank you and good evening. I'm going to try to be fairly brief. I'm going to talk a little bit about the site's inventory overview. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, the purpose of the site's inventory is to ensure there's enough land zoned at appropriate densities to accommodate the RHNA allocation. That's the regional housing needs allocation plus buffer. It's not a list of sites that all sites that may be developed. Some identified sites will not be developed with housing during the 8 years, while some sites that are not identified in the inventory will likely be developed with housing. It's basically a capacity analysis to ensure there's a capacity for housing. And the housing elements, policies, and programs focus on encouraging new housing production, increasing development feasibility, and expanding new housing opportunities. Briefly, the site's inventory methodology, they were identified through a methodical review of individual parcels, primarily within the 10 GPU study areas, and the initial vetting of site typologies was approved by HCD. This looked at things like the Molly Stones shopping area and various other sites throughout the city to discern what HCD would expect from us in terms of analysis. Sites were ranked as to the likelihood of redevelopment, one being least likely. These are sites with substantial constraints, locations of chain retail, gas stations with one exception. I think it's just one exception. There are no gas stations included in the inventory. And at the highest level is 5, which included pipeline projects or with owner or developer interest. HCD has told us that the gold standard for inclusion in an inventory is whether or not there is owner or developer interest. Other sites were included primarily in the 4 category. For example, those with vacant uses, sites with low FAR, or buildings that had low FAR in a sea of parking, older developments, et cetera. And we met with developers to discern what they look for to redevelopment sites. We reviewed zone versus built density to determine assumptions, and we continued to make revisions to the inventory, which meant that some units and sites were removed while others were added. This is an iterative process. As you can imagine, a developer may come in and say, I'm interested in this site, and we didn't include it, but we can now include it in the inventory. Recent developments average well over 100% of zone density because of the use of density bonus. Talk a little bit about that. And the relatively low density of 50 DU per acre in the city results in a high probability of projects using the density bonus and maximizing available density. So using the conservative estimate of that we can expect 100% of zone density to be developed for larger sites, and then only 50% for smaller sites, because usually smaller sites have difficulties with constraints, site constraints, et cetera, that make it difficult to develop a large project. And this approach with evidence of support was confirmed by HCD as appropriate. This map is a tax credit allocation committee opportunity areas map. One of the many goals of the affirmatively furthering fair housing, which I'll talk about in a minute, is to locate housing in areas where there is either highest or high resources and limit where there is poor resources. We can talk more about that later. Next slide, please. In determining multifamily residential capacity, we looked at residential development approvals between 2017 and 2022, and basically 11 of 14 infill projects exceeded 100% of zone density. That is over 50 DU per acre. In aggregate, this was at approximately 58.3 units per acre. There are 3 outlier development projects with much lower densities than the infill housing projects, resulting in an average of 18.2 DU per acres, but these are typically in places that either in flood zones, away from transit, or being ownership. Ownership developments tend to be more townhomes and lower density than rental housing. In terms of realistic capacity, as I mentioned, we used 100% of base zone density for multifamily infill sites at 50 or 35 DU an acre in accordance with the base zoning under those sites. And for sites smaller than a half an acre, we assume 50% of base density, again, because of the difficulty of developing small sites. Any sites that we found that were similar to our outlier projects, we estimated the density only at 18.2 DU per acre. In terms of mixed use and commercial, again, looking at the same time period. 6:26 p.m. Siri thinks I was talking to him. Anyway, I'm sorry. 20 of 25 projects included residential uses. This is in mixed use or commercial approvals. 9 projects were 100% residential and 11 were mixed use. And the average density was about 49 units per acre, which is just under 100% of zone density. In terms of realistic capacity, we looked at this 80% of the trend, which results in about 39 DU per acre, assuming that some percentage will have actually not have commercial as well as residential. And again, smaller sites, less than half an acre, 50% of base density. One thing that's very important in this round of the housing element is discussing non-vacant sites. If we're including sites that have uses on them, we have to look at HCD's guidance that articulates the factors to look for in determining redevelopment potential. As I mentioned before, the state has said multiple times the gold standard is owner or developer interest. However, there are many things to consider, including age of development, local development trends, land value information, known leases, degree of underutilization, et cetera. Next slide. Any individual factor cannot be taken alone, but rather in the context of the market and development trends. For example, the presence or absence of a long lease is not by itself determinative, in fact, because leases can be bought out. In fact, there's a project in the East Bay that I'm very familiar with where it was a fully leased office building that actually had new leases, long-term leases. A developer bought everybody out and is developing high-rise housing on that site. Similarly, current owner disinterest does not necessarily prevent inclusion on the site's inventory because many things can change in an 8-year period. Again, we're looking for the capacity that makes sense, that if somebody wanted to come in and develop, we have the capacity to accommodate that. We have to ultimately consider the extent to which the residential use is the highest and best use, plus experience with development on similar sites in the city and regionally. The state allows us to look outside of our city borders as well. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Zach to talk about pipeline housing projects.
Thank you, Diana. So as part of our sites inventory, we are also looking at projects that are already in the pipeline. And so this can include projects under construction, projects that are approved but have not yet started construction, and housing proposals that are under review in various stages of the process. The key being that occupancy will occur after June 30th of last year, 2022. So right now, we do have a strong start to progress on this year's RENA allocation, or this cycle's RENA allocation, as we do have over 2,900 projects or 2,900 housing units in the pipeline, which constitutes approximately 42% of our total RENA. Also, another piece that contributes to our sites inventory are accessory dwelling units. And these are units that are going to be occurring in our single family neighborhoods, in our high and highest resource areas all around the city. And over the last 4 years, we have had strong and increasing interest and permitting of accessory dwelling units. And you can see the final numbers for 2022 were the strongest over that 4-year period. So we do have over that period an average of 60 permits issued. To be conservative, we are estimating an annual average of 55 new ADUs each year over the 8-year period, which would net approximately 440 new units over our RENA cycle. And we are also using very conservative assumptions with how we assign affordability. We know that many ADUs are used to meet to house lower income individuals and families. And so we did factor that in based on available data and other studies out there. We are going with very conservative breakdowns, including 15% above moderate for our allocations. And then we will be monitoring this on an annual basis. I mean, we do have a policy and programs to ensure that we're able to maintain this level of production over the full 8-year period. So I'm also going to start to cover some of the highlights of our revised draft housing element, which includes additional information on our general plan update and Measure Y, what the city is doing with its funding and properties to support affordable housing production, supporting missing middle housing, as well as affirmatively furthering fair housing, and an overview of where our current set of goals, policies, and programs are. So the first piece was we really wanted to highlight how our housing element and our general plan update are really connected. Ideally, with the process starting in 2018, we would already be through the general plan adoption process, and that would be supporting our housing element. Unfortunately, due to the COVID pandemic and other factors, that process has been extended, and we're now looking at a target to adopt by the end of 2023. But right now, where we are in the general plan update process, we have a draft land use map that has increased density with the potential to add up to 21,000 new housing units over the next 20 years. And so that would significantly increase housing capacity to provide for both this and future housing cycles. And this was purposely by design. Over 90% of the sites on our sites inventory are within one of the 10 general plan study areas. And so with the adoption of our general plan, most, if not, the vast majority of our sites inventory sites will see a meaningful increase in their housing capacity as well. So we already have a buffer of 42%, and that would just significantly increase that buffer to reach our RENA for this cycle. And so we wanted to show you a map. As I noted, you can see that boundaries for our 10 general plan study areas and the location of the sites on our sites inventory and the overlap between the two. And then also, as part of our general plan update, we are working to facilitate a community conversation around Measure Y, how our general plan can align with that, and the next steps to moving forward and building consensus around what a future a ballot initiative could look like with the adoption of our general plan. And depending on how the general plan is adopted, that could put us in line to have an updated ballot initiative in 2024. To also highlight the way that these two initiatives are aligned, we did add a policy that supports the community discussion and highlights the constraint of Measure Y and how we could potentially move forward. Another aspect we wanted to highlight was the city properties that are being utilized to support the production of affordable housing. That includes the city-owned property where Kiku Crossing is being built, the city-owned parking lot adjacent to the former Talbot's building, where we're currently in the development review for a project that could be approximately 60 units. And then we also have another property down along El Camino in the south end of town that could be used to leverage as future an affordable housing project as well. And then we also have our housing fund, which currently has approximately $5.8 million in it, and could generate an additional $26 million over the next 8 years. And then how we could utilize that funding for the construction or realization of additional affordable units. And we also have augmented our policy H1.2 to clarify these initiatives and what we're doing on both city-owned property and with our funding. And then this is an overview of the Kiku Crossing project. For this project, it is approximately coming out to approximately $760,000 per unit. And so that is a metric that we've looked at the overall affordable numbers that we need to achieve. But it is important to note that we have a limited amount of city-owned property, and that this doesn't include land costs. So if we're looking at acquiring land as part of the development of affordable housing, this number would definitely go higher. The other area that it's a missing piece of our housing equation is really this missing middle housing. And this is the housing that meets the needs of families that maybe don't meet affordability levels, but don't have the means to own a home or pay rent at where the market is. And so we've got a variety of policies that help produce and support the production of missing middle housing. Those could be accessory dwelling units, they could be townhome units, projects that are smaller in nature, generally 4 to 10 units, oftentimes located in or adjacent to single-family neighborhoods. So we do have a number of policies that we think will help support and increase production of this important piece of our housing for the community. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back off to Diana to discuss our affirmatively furthering fair housing initiatives.
Thank you, Zach. This is a new component for housing elements in the state of California, and it's modeled on a federal affirmatively furthering fair housing program that was suspended when Donald Trump became president, but as they're working to bring it back, the state passed a law that essentially mirrors those requirements, and it includes information. We have to provide information on fair housing enforcement and outreach capacity, segregation and integration, disparities in access to opportunity, disproportionate housing needs and displacement risks, and lastly, something we mentioned before, racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty as well as affluence. Next slide. Some of the challenges identified in the AFFH, which was primarily conducted by Root Policy, who's worked closely with the state on developing AFFH guidance. The challenges identified, including racial and ethnic minority populations, are disproportionately impacted by poverty, overcrowding, cost burdens, and homelessness. Northeast areas of the city are the most impacted, and discrimination complaints are generally based on disability and race. In terms of disability, it's landlords refusing to make reasonable accommodations to disabled tenants. The city's approach to address these issues, we've included new programs to reduce barriers to housing in high opportunity areas, promoting housing supply, conserving and improving assets in areas of poverty, and protecting residents from displacement. As mentioned before, I won't go in a lot of detail about this. One of the inventory analysis demonstrates that the proposed affordable housing sites are not in areas with existing concentrations of lower income households, at least the proposed, those sites that we have identified to have, that would have affordable units in them or could have it. The inventory, therefore, is not expected to increase segregation and further the location of affordable units, according to the study. They will provide lower income households with access to transit and services. The other required components include housing resources, climate change context, and energy conservation requirements, a review of the prior housing element. In the last housing element, the 81.3% of the last RENA cycle of 3,100 plus units were developed. Not necessarily according to the income categories, but definitely a large chunk of the units. You'll note that last cycle, 3,164 units. The new cycle is twice that amount, more than twice that amount. The city also adopted a commercial linkage fee and increased the inclusionary requirements to 15% and made a number of process improvements and code amendments. And with that, I'll turn it back to Zach. Oh, it's Eloisa, never mind.
Thank you, Diana. I'll just give a really quick overview of the goals, policies, and programs that are included in the housing element. There are 5 overarching goals. Goal 1 is production, and that has 21 policies. Goal 2 is preservation, which includes 6 policies. Goal 3 is protection with 7 policies. Goal 4 is promotion with 5 policies, and Goal 5, which is the AFFH goal, includes 14 policies. Under Goal 1, the production goal, some of the policies and programs include, actions to utilize public funds and properties to build more affordable units, support ADU production, encourage housing development through zoning code amendments. There is a new policy to coordinate with water and sewer providers. And finally, as Zach mentioned earlier, there is a new policy to address Measure Y constraints and increase housing capacity to over 21,000 new units by supporting the adoption of the general plan update. Goal 2 for preservation includes policies to prevent conversion of existing affordable units from becoming market rate units, the use of public funds to acquire units or require developers to replace lost units, to indirectly preserve affordable housing by improving the quality of life of residents to prevent displacement, incentivize upgrades to low-income homes through rehabilitation, accessibility modifications, as well as energy efficiency changes. And finally, to enable capital improvements and resiliency projects that protect against threats posed by climate change. Under Goal 3, protection, policies that are include for the prevention of gentrification and displacement, to address homelessness and increase shelter capacity, to affirmatively fund and support outreach services for at-risk renters, prioritize special needs tenants and below market rate units, explore a rental registry to track rents and monitor trends in evictions, and to undertake several actions to affirmatively further fair housing. Under Goal 4, the promotion goal, policies include actions to increase access and awareness of housing programs through the use of technology, provide education and information on regulatory requirements and specific programs and protections that are offered locally, regionally, and by the state, to support the countywide rental waitlist to centralize the occupancy of the city's BMR units, conduct public outreach and a diversity of methods. And there's also a new policy that has been added to conduct direct outreach to owners and developers that have properties that are located on the site's inventory. And finally, goal 5 is the AFFH goal, which has various actions. Within the AFFH goals, the policies do cross-reference items that are interwoven with the housing plan's other 4 goals, policies, and programs. So you'll see within the individual policies, or sometimes as a reference, refer to, to a certain goal. So a lot of them do correspond. Some of the ones from goal 5, H5 do correspond with some of the other goals, H1 through 4. And finally, this goal also includes policies to assist persons with disabilities who also experience housing discrimination, as Diana mentioned earlier, due to low economic opportunity and the failure of landlords to provide reasonable accommodations. At this point, I will turn it over to Zach, who will discuss the revised draft housing element timeline.
Thank you, Eloisa. Where we are now, as has been noted, we published a revised draft that addressed the comments raised by HCD on December 30th. We had a 10-day public comment period, 7 days is the minimum required. We held a public hearing before the Planning Commission on the 10th, and we are here this evening presenting the housing element to you tonight. And so we have received a high number of public comments on our draft housing element. You've seen many of them. A lot have come in over the last week, a total of approximately 130 as of this afternoon. We did receive a couple of comment letters from groups and organizations, including the Housing Action Coalition, Sierra Club Loma Prieta Chapter, and the Beresford Hillsdale Neighborhood Association. The comments covered a variety of topics, including raising concerns about the feasibility of properties on the site's inventory, concerns about too much housing being allowed, concerns about the location and spread of the housing around the city, and then also a number of comments expressed support for adopting the current draft of the housing element. So we did, in response to the public comments during that public comment period, staff is recommending a couple of revisions to the housing element for the council's consideration. The first one is to refine policy H1.2 to clarify that the city is utilizing public funding and properties to support the development of affordable housing, and including a program for each of the city-owned properties as to how that could move forward and be used for affordable housing production. We are also recommending a new policy or new program to policy H1.7. And there was a comment that noted that there was, for properties in the C and the E districts that aren't within the residential overlay, that a residential use, while it is allowed in the district, is a special use as opposed to a permitted use. And so we did identify an opportunity to process a code amendment to change that so any C or E district would allow residential uses as permitted. These are uses that are already allowed either way, but this would reduce the barrier of requiring a special use permit. So we are recommending that we make that commitment to amend the code at the front end of our housing cycle. And then also, I did provide this document to you earlier today. We are recommending the addition of a supplemental table to the site's inventory appendix, Appendix C. And what this does is, since we have heard a number of questions and comments about feasibility of various sites on our site's inventory, we wanted to pull together all of the various pieces of information that provide the body of evidence to justify why these sites do have housing development feasibility and the realistic capacity that we've assigned can be achieved. And so we are recommending that for these 3 items, that as part of an action, if you take that tonight, to include these revisions in the draft housing element that goes back, or the adopted version that will ultimately submit to the state. And so there were a number of sites. These are some of our bigger sites with higher housing potential, concerns raised about those sites. I won't go through each of these in detail, but happy to go back and revisit if you have questions. For example, I know Bridgepoint has been one that's often been raised. We've identified this site as an opportunity site. One, we have conservative numbers. We're not anticipating the full site would be redeveloped, but there is a significant amount of surface parking that we identify as underutilized. And so the housing units we've identified for this site, we see the opportunity that wouldn't displace the existing uses, but rather utilize the parking lots to achieve housing while maintaining that shopping center. Or maybe there's new mixed-use buildings where uses could be relocated. So there's ways to intermix housing with that existing use. And so it isn't something where just because there's a large retailer that's there, or maybe a newer, longer-term lease, that wouldn't preclude the ability to develop housing on this site. And this is also a site that would see significant increased capacity as part of our general plan update. So for these reasons, we do feel this is a very justifiable site to include on our sites inventory. Similar to the Hillsdale Mall, same concept. You wouldn't need to redevelop the mall in order to achieve housing on this site. And we also do have strong owner-developer interest at this site as well. And we did originally have a little under 2,000 units assigned, which could be achieved under our current zoning. We have reduced that to 1,200 based on input from the property owner and to include a conservative assumption. But we do feel that there is feasibility to achieve closer to that 2,000 on that grouping of properties there. And so these are the other sites. We can revisit them if you have questions later on. And then also this is a snapshot of what this supplemental sites inventory table would look like. What we're doing is pulling information. The state's Excel spreadsheet for the sites inventory is not the most user-friendly when it comes to navigating and understanding the pieces that make a site feasible. And so what we're trying to do here is paint that picture in a clearer table that really just focuses on those elements that provide the evidence to get us to a reasonable justification that we can achieve housing here. So we did have a planning commission hearing on January 10th. At that meeting, there were concerns raised about the sites inventory, the methodology that established the realistic capacity calculation, and there was concern that there was lack of substantial evidence to support the sites and the housing capacity identified. There was also comments and concerns about our goals, policies, and programs having not been adequately revised to address all of HCD's comments and needing more significant commitments and measurable metrics. Overall, following that discussion, the Planning Commission did vote 3-0 with 2 commissioners absent to recommend that the council not adopt the revised draft housing element. It's centered around four findings: that the sites inventory did not include substantial evidence to demonstrate capacity and ability to meet the RHNA, that our fair housing plan does not adequately and fully address AFFH requirements, that the housing element does not adequately address the city's constraints for housing production, and that the goals, policies, and programs haven't been sufficiently updated to meet all of HCD's comments. So tonight, for next steps, we would receive public comment and then look at taking action with the staff recommendation to adopt the revised draft housing element. Following, if it was to be adopted, we would work to get the housing element submitted to HCD along with whatever feedback and direction was provided as part of that action. And then the state has a 60-day statutory review period under which, during that time, they could either certify or return the housing element with comments, at which point staff would work to revise. But we do also want to note that during that period, staff will continue to engage with HCD, make efforts to meet and understand where concerns may be, and work proactively to address any issues that arise. So we're ready to respond promptly and expeditiously should there be any additional comments provided to us. Also, just wanted to note that there is a penalty for not submitting a housing element that is in substantial compliance with state statutes by January 31st. For this housing cycle, there is no longer a 120-day grace period, as has been allowed by the state and is noted in state statute for prior cycles. And a jurisdiction without an adopted housing element is at risk of losing local control and subject to what's termed as the builder's remedy, which allows developers and property owners to submit development applications if they meet certain criteria to be built without being limited by local rules or density requirements. So the key is to be in substantial compliance, you don't necessarily need HCD certification by the 31st, but we do need adoption supported by evidence that our housing element is in substantial compliance under state law. And so with that, our recommendation is that you move forward with a resolution that approves the general plan amendment to update our housing element for the 6th cycle that is compliant with state law as outlined in the attached resolution and includes a plan for at least 7,000 new housing units, affirmatively furthers fair housing, and determine that the housing element is exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act. And we would also recommend that you include the staff recommended revisions as part of your action. And so that does conclude staff's presentation, and we are available if you have any questions.
Yes, before we turn to questions from council, we would like to take a quick 5-minute break for those who need it. So let's resume in 5 minutes. And we're back. Thank you so much for being patient with us. This is the time for council clarifying questions. I turn it over to council. Would anyone like to begin? Councilmember Hedges.
So I have a few questions. I think one of them is actually a two-part. So you did some talking about Bridgepoint. And I've been involved actually with the building of Bridgepoint and know it pretty well. And in the inventory breakdown that we got, Bridgepoint was cited as 1,105 units, and something you had on one of the pages cited it as 600 units. Can you tell me the discrepancy?
There are a number of sites in the Bridgepoint area. The site that I was focusing on that I believe has around 600 units is the shopping center itself. There's a couple other sites that are adjacent to the shopping center that cumulatively probably constitute the number you're seeing right there. But I would have to look specifically at the table, but I believe we've got multiple sites, each with a different housing allocation to it.
I know that at the eastern end of Bridgepoint, we had a big fight over the skating rink there, and SPI wanted to put housing there, and that went away pretty fast. So we'll see what happens with that. There is some vacancies there, though. So one of the things that was cited to me by folks who would like to see us vote no on this tonight was that that we can't build these units within 8 years, and they felt that was required. In the past, we've only had to zone for housing. I don't believe there was a requirement for it to be built in any length of time. Would you please comment on what our requirements are and timeline for getting any units, any areas cited and those units in it being built?
I'm happy to answer that. Again, the inventory is an exercise to determine whether there's a capacity for development. And it is not a requirement that those units be built in those 8 years. The goal of the city is to make every available effort to allow development to occur within those 8 years, but it's not necessarily required to develop all those units within those 8 years. The city does provide in the housing element a list of quantified objectives, which are the actual number of units that we think will be built within the 8 years. And a lot of factors are at play. We just need to demonstrate that they could be built within those 8 years in terms of, programs for like lot consolidation, things to incentivize development.
Thank you. The builder's remedy. I'm confused as to when that would apply. Would it be if we turned this down? Would it apply immediately after January 31st?
Yes, I can start with that, and Diana, I may have you jump in on that. Yes, that is our understanding, that it would kick in immediately after January 31st.
And I have a follow-up on that. So assuming that we vote for it tonight and HCD turns it down, when would the builder's remedy go into effect? Or would we be given some time to try to repair the things they don't like?
It's a really good question, and I wish that I had a definitive answer, and I don't think anybody has a definitive answer. One of the main ways in which a jurisdiction can demonstrate that we are in statutory compliance is what we've done here, which is enumerate every line of requirement in housing element law and then provide a citation of where that information is located within the housing element. So we are going forward with an affirmative statement saying we are in compliance with housing element law. Then the onus would be on the state to say, no, we're not, and that would probably, as Zach said, we're going to be continuing to discuss with them. This is sort of new territory in the world, and in speaking with a number of my colleagues on the planning end as well as on the legal end, it's unclear whether or not the builder's remedy would literally kick in on February 1st. I think that by making these steps and demonstrating that the city is in substantial compliance will forestall that for some period of time. We're hopeful that by continuing to have conversations with the state and work on the housing element after February 1st, that will also help prevent for a builder's remedy application coming in. Ultimately, somebody in the Bay Area, this is all new for us in the Bay Area, somebody in the Bay Area is going to take this to court. As I think it's been mentioned before, there are only 2 housing elements in the Bay Area that have been certified so far. And all the rest, there's a third one. Redwood City is close. They have said it's in compliance, but I don't believe that Redwood City has actually adopted it yet. So I think we're gonna find out as more jurisdictions produce adopt housing elements that with the same kind of statutory language saying, here's how we've complied with absolutely everything, that it'll be interesting to find out how many jurisdictions do get hit with the builder's remedy proposal. I wish I could be more definitive, but it's just way too new of territory to talk.
Much of the emails I've gotten are worried about that. That's why I asked the question. To follow up again on Bridgepoint, the height limits at Bridgepoint are different than the other parts of the city. They're 75 feet. If a developer has the proper amount of below market rate housing, could a density bonus take it a couple of stories higher? Would that help with the housing inventory?
Zach, can you weigh in on that question?
Definitely. Yes, the state density bonus law does allow for projects that meet certain affordability requirements and certain percentages of their units to request concessions, which could be additional height beyond a height limit.
And has it, are you in agreement that it is 75 feet? Because it's always been an H and P.
That it depends on the specific area, and I'm not as well versed as I am in the details of that, but I know there are areas in there where you can get up to 75 feet.
Okay, and a final question: Redwood City actually had a section in its general plan that recognized that local craftspeople have to be somewhat protected, and there's no mention of any labor issues within this general plan.
Typically, local jurisdictions do not have local labor requirements because they are tied, especially with affordable housing projects, it's tied to the source of funding, whether it's a state prevailing wage job or a Davis-Bacon job, which is the federal requirement. So typically, those kinds of projects are negotiated at the project level, not at the housing element level.
I'll have more to say about that later, but it doesn't require it in Redwood City. It just encourages it. That's it.
Anyone else? Councilmember Lorraine.
Thank you. To follow Councilmember Hedges' last question, and perhaps broaden it a little more, I think we've heard from a number of folks in the public who asked to potentially add policies and potentially remove portions from this draft housing element. And yet we appear to be a week out of the deadline to submit. And so could you elaborate on whether it's possible at this point to add a policy such as the one that might mirror what's in Redwood City's housing element related to encouraging labor local labor being a part of development on some of these sites?
Yes, if we were to add a policy like that, we would need to repost the draft housing element for a 7-day public review period. So seeing as we're already at the 24th of January, it wouldn't give us sufficient time to submit by January 31st.
Thank you. I did have one question related to the supplemental sites inventory table and whether it could, other council members and or staff would think it would be useful to include in these columns I believe the feasibility numeric score that was described earlier in the presentation, like the 0 through 5 number that indicated to some extent, a number of factors that combine to give us a sense of like how likely within the next period it might be developed on.
Yeah, that is definitely something we could add. This supplemental table, it's not generating new information, but rather it's pulling information from the housing element, starting with the sites inventory, and then other areas to put the evidence we've compiled for each site to justify its development feasibility and the realistic capacity for the number of units assigned to it. So if there's additional information in the housing element that the council feels would help justify a site's inventory, whether it's capacity or feasibility, we can definitely include that in the table.
Thank you. Those are my questions at this time.
Thank you very much, Mayor Lee, and I want to say thank you to everybody on the team who put this together. I mean, I almost lost my eyesight reading it, so I can only imagine what happened. And I hope we have VSP provisions for everyone so they can go get stronger glasses. But I really, really appreciate and the fact that you've really doubled down. This is something our entire community is working on, so I just wanted to say that. I've got one question raised based on Councilmember Lorraine's comment, but first, one of our strategic objectives, as you mentioned, is to evaluate increasing the minimum residential ratio in multi-use buildings. And what programs specifically are within the housing element that would take advantage of that if we changed it, so that we could outreach to community, because I would think that could greatly increase the number of housing units that we have downtown as an example.
Yeah, I think I will ask Zach to weigh in on that.
When for the concept of setting a minimum density for mixed-use projects, what we're looking to achieve is mixed-use projects that want to take advantage of state density bonus law. We want to establish a reasonable number of housing that gets included in that project, and not just the minimum to benefit from it. Because for a mixed-use project, the entire project, including the non-residential portions, can benefit, receive concessions from being subject to under state density bonus law. And so the goal being, if a project's going to include residential and benefit from state density bonus law, we want to make sure there's a sufficient amount of residential in that project. And then the second piece, and this was highlighted by the last year's council, was to study the feasibility of maybe including a requirement that any mixed-use project in certain zones include a residential component. So there's a commitment on the first piece, which is setting that density, and then we'll need to go through the exercise of figuring out what makes the most sense. And then the second piece would be to have the discussion and if it makes sense to set a requirement that all mixed-use projects in certain zones have a residential component.
But there's only upside from a housing perspective. Yeah. Okay, thank you. And given the trends of increasing commercial vacancy, how have you considered that in coming up with the site feasibility? Are you using today's standards or projections of what may happen? Because certainly nationally and locally, we're seeing increased commercial vacancies.
Diana, do you want to weigh in on that one?
Right. I think we've been looking at trends within the community and within the region as a whole of commercial properties becoming vacant. When we met with the developers, one developer in particular suggested that a low FAR building, office building, Class C from the 1980s with a sea of parking around it is something very attractive to them in terms of redevelopment for housing. And in fact, there were existing tenants in there and they worked to relocate them. So it's not a matter of simply, vacancies, but actually poor use of the site. And we were seeing it all over the Bay Area. And I know that the 21 Elements group is putting together actually additional analysis on these kinds of developments for further justification. So what we looked at was, we took the input from developers about things like an office building in a sea of parking, et cetera, and sort of applied that lens to other areas in the city that might, generally speaking, within the 10 GPU study areas, looked at other kinds of buildings, like one-story buildings along El Camino that are older, maybe not have the highest and best use on them, and then factor in, a lot of owners have expressed interest in redeveloping their properties. So I think it's a combination of factors to really discern which sites that we thought were important to include. If a particular building has just obviously had a lot of renovation work, we did not include it. I mean, we assumed that anytime there's been a huge investment in a development, with rare exceptions, those are the ones that are not going to be feasibly redeveloped within the 8-year cycle. If they are included, it is because there has been either developer interest or the owner is actually thinking about changing its use.
Okay, thank you. And moving on to 7.2.3, if I got it correctly, specifically within that, a couple of policies, 3.4 and 3.6, regarding rental policies. I was interested that some of the sub-programs, as I would refer to them, are research and evaluate, and some of them are enact and adopt. And given the fact that whether it's tenant relocation payments or rental registries or anything within that section, there was just a very high-level description. And number one, my question is, why is that in a land use document? And then number two, related to all of those, shouldn't we be thinking of more along the research, evaluate, see what other cities are doing as we look at these things? And that's what, when I was speaking to other cities, the way their housing element has approached, and specifically with regard to the AB 1482 tenant relocation payments from day one. As I understand it, in 2016, that was part of Measure Q that was voted down by the voters that had tenant relocation payments from day one. And I'm wondering how we could put something in this document as opposed to going through and having a robust, public debate about it.
That's a really good question. There are a number of factors involved in a lot of these tenant assistance programs. Some come from AFFH, and a specific requirement that we have to demonstrate firm commitments to prevent displacement and areas of gentrification. Some of those items were, there's state law. There's some that are in there, the state law. The item from day one is a best practices issue that has been raised by a number of jurisdictions in the Bay Area, and that the HCD has specifically cited as something that jurisdictions should increase the protections for people. So that's how, so we've got AFFH requirements. We have HCD telling us that they want firm commitments to really move the needle, if you will, on tenant displacement. And all those things factored together. We're in sync with many jurisdictions specifically in San Mateo County in terms of what the city is planning to do in that recommendation, those recommended policies. I don't know if Zach wants to share any further information on that or not. No.
Was that a no? Yeah,
I could try to add a little bit more information. As Diana mentioned, one of the recurring comments that we did get from HCD is they wanted to see firmer commitments. So that is part of the reason why it is in there as something that's actionable. And the time period for that, it's, we said that would be accomplished within the first year of the housing element. So it's not necessarily, as soon as the housing element is adopted, then that action is implemented. We still have to go through a process. We still have to do research, bring it to the city council, do community outreach before that became a policy.
So the reason why I'm asking, I think we should go through and have that debate. And there's a lot here that's very important. It's the inconsistency and the fact that some of them, the points are enact this and some are research and evaluate. If we had the opportunity for all of this to be either within our blue sky strategic objective or within this document, more focused on research and evaluate, because I guess my concern, and this is getting into comments, so maybe I'll be brief, but is that there will be unintended consequences and people will misinterpret what's here if we wind up deciding a nuance.
I just will follow up, understand your concern, follow up by saying that HCD was extremely explicit that we cannot say research and evaluate everything. We had to make some choices on items that we would say we will do this. Again, if we get through the process of actually, none of these things are going to happen overnight, and there will be, as Eloisa says, there'll be additional opportunity for discussion, but we had to write in here that this is our intention. Whether or not, if something comes up and the council decides, wait, this, as you say, there's an unintended consequence, that we will address as we go further. We were explicitly told we cannot put forth an implementation plan that lists every single item as, oh, we'll look into this and decide later. We have to make a commitment.
Okay. And then finally, following up on Councilmember Lorraine's comment, am I to understand that means we really can't change anything in this document if we're going to try and get it into HCD by the 31st?
Yes, that is correct, particularly things that would be considered substantive. I mean, I think we could make some clarifying language if something needs to be clarified. Is that correct, Diana? But, in terms of adding policies or adjusting timelines and things of that nature, I believe that would be subject to a 7-day public
Yes.
review period.
And I should mention that, when we spent a lot of time with prior council discussing these very issues. And so these weren't things that we just recently came up with. This has been on the books for quite some time. And so it's not, and as Eloisa says, we're really stuck in trying to make a deadline based on, not wanting to come against an issue where we have to go back and republish. This is a problem with every jurisdiction that I'm working with right now, actually.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you again for all of your time. I imagine, this is over a year's worth of documentation and research that you've all put into it. So make sure we acknowledge and thank you for all your hard work. One question that I have a couple questions. One is very low income and missing middle. Do we feel as though with the proposal we're putting forward that we're going to be able to hit those numbers in those specific demographics?
We have programs that will facilitate. Again, I think the primary issue is cost and financing or funding. So when we say we're going to implement these programs, we're trying to do everything we can to make it more feasible for these things to happen. But in the end, it still takes a developer and funding to make it happen. And these are things that city does not actually have control over. The city doesn't build housing. So we create the perfect blend of opportunities for it to happen. And then work with outreach to developers, outreach to the community to make those, to see how we can come to some fruition on some of these items.
Okay. I'm hesitant to make any suggestions of changes because it doesn't sound like there's any room to do that. But I would like to know, one of the things that I've seen in some of the larger development projects is a still high level of vacancy and also a inability to take commercial space on the ground floors and actually get units in there. Do we have anything in place, or could we put something in place, maybe in the next iteration, that would say that if they can't fill commercial space on the ground floor in a certain period of time, we could potentially convert them to housing, additional housing?
Yeah, as we mentioned, it's probably not something that we would be able to
Do now.
add at this point. However, I'll start, and Zach, you can weigh in. I think if it's something that, the council was in agreement with, that they wanted to see included, it could be something that we could explore.
I think the other thing that we would also want to note is just because something isn't in the housing element does not mean it's an initiative that the council could still explore it. When we bring these policies forward, that could still be something that gets adopted or as part of the policy. So, and then ultimately, if that helps facilitate housing, that could be something that we get credit for. So we could definitely still look at that. And when we bring forward a suite of policies or code amendments, we could look at that option as well if that's a desire of the council.
And that actually kind of is a good segue to my other part of the question, which is when it comes to things like tenant protections and rental registry, if the verbiage in there says that we will be doing this, and then we don't end up doing this because we open it to public debate and said, no, we don't want to do that, what is the impact to being in breach of what we said we're going to do in this document?
That's a good question. I think that essentially what HCD has said in its emboldened state of enforcement of housing laws would say that this is a contract with the state, and that they have expectations that we will do the things that we say we do. When it comes to things like evaluate and implement, but we don't know how to evaluate and implement because we haven't done the study yet. I think those are the items that are, those are the items that there's a little bit more leeway, and they understand that you can't do your studies for all, however many policies you have. You can't do them before you submit your housing element. It's not possible. With respect to the rental registry, this is a countywide effort. It's not just the city. And so it's something that would be a benefit to the community and for the community members all throughout the county. So, and this is happening in other counties as well.
Thank you. No more questions. Thank you.
I just want to check in with council. Are we in agreement that at this point there will be no substantial changes? We are not going to contemplate making substantial changes to policy or this document. Are we all agreed on that? No. Do you mind speaking up?
So just to be open with everybody, I've met with a lot of different groups on all sides of the housing elements, and quite frankly, I'm very, well, let me back up and start again. There's 4 new people here. I've been on the outside of the discussions on the housing element. I'm involved in a lot of other things, and many of the other new people may be that way. And now we come up to the 24th, and I'm not complaining about staff. I want to make that clear. But the process. And we can't make any changes. And there are people, and sitting in this audience, I'm sure there are people waiting on Zoom that want to talk about changes. It's very frustrating. There's several things I would like to see. I'm concerned about a couple of the policies that could limit people wanting to build ADUs or work against very small owners of dwelling units that they rent. So policies are just that, but maybe we can get away with refining those policies later on. Hopefully, if you could comment on that after I get through. If we would be in trouble by not totally changing or eliminating, but refining them later. And adding something that would have to do with not a requirement on labor, but speaking of labor and making sure that we're recognizing the local people that actually break their fingernails and other stuff doing the work for us. Okay, if you want to respond.
I'd be happy to. Your point is well taken. I don't think we're trying to suggest that this is written in stone, that we know that HCD is going to come back and ask us for more information. And so I think that as we continue on through the spring, that we will definitely have opportunities to have further discussions. I think that, like I say, this is an iteration of it, and I think we all agree that there's further things that could be dealt with, especially after we get the next comment letter from HCD.
Yeah.
And I wanted to add one more thing and asked Patrice. Patrice, I'm getting comments on my screen popping up from people, and I don't think anybody else is getting it. I don't have a problem with that, but I want to make sure that we're not violating anything under the Brown Act.
No, it's popping up on your screen because of the connection to the Outlook. And those comments that come in, we will publish as post up until the end of this meeting time. Any comments that continue to come in are rolled up and made part of the agenda packet. So
I just
they
want
are.
to make sure I'm not skating on thin ice.
No, I don't believe so. The city attorney can happily weigh in.
I believe we had another person who wanted to weigh in on your question.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to sort of piggyback on Diana's comment and make sure that it is clear that the policies before you tonight are not set in stone. You do have the opportunity to give us further direction. What we're trying to convey tonight is that there is a 7-day public comment period that does need to take place. And we can't submit to HCD without satisfying that public comment period. We are under a deadline for the local adoption, but we do fully expect to have ongoing further dialogues with HCD, and that we are going to receive further comments from them. And so there is the opportunity for further iterations and to take further direction and to continue to work on the policies. We do very much believe that this is one iteration that's going to continue to evolve. And so we do believe that these policies are going to change from what you see before you tonight, and that we're going to have the opportunity to continue to see a future iteration of them. And so we do expect to have additional direction from our council.
And just to follow up, then, when these things change, we'll be notified possibly through email on those specific things that have changed, so we don't have to search through the 1,400 pages to find them.
Well, we would be taking direction from council. It would be going through a public process. You would have very specific information on exactly what changed. You would have red lines before you, and we would be doing it based on the direction from you. You would have information on the direction we received from HCD. And you would most likely have another study session before you, so you would be able to have very specific conversations regarding any changes that we would make, and you would be directing the changes.
Can I ask a procedural question just for clarification? So would we, in this scenario, if there is an appetite to make some policy changes that are allowable, right, or recommended, that we would move potentially tonight to adopt as an option, with the understanding that this is an ongoing and iterative process, that any potential considered amendments would also have to, would reinitiate the 7-day comment period and future study? Is that, or would you recommend not taking a vote tonight and returning through the whole public?
I think we would recommend taking the vote tonight.
Okay,
and adopting, and not making substantive changes tonight, but any clarifying changes I think would be okay. We would want to be careful that what we submitted is what the public has already seen, and that any changes made tonight would really just be corrections or clarifications.
Great. And then, just as a reminder to the community and to the council, we are going through a Blue Skies strategic planning process. And so this is not in any way a one-shot deal, right? And if you have priorities that are important to you that you feel are not adequately represented in the housing element, we are policymakers and we get lots of shots, right? That's our job, is to keep showing up and keep advocating for our visions and the community's vision. So, I also, I want to, put some deep breaths into this process, remind everyone that, there are many opportunities to advance your policy objectives through Blue Skies, which is coming up on February 11th, as well as through future conversations in this very process, which is, as staff has said, not set in stone. So I had a couple of questions myself. I wanted to ask our consultant and also staff, what is your response to community who say, this is too much housing?
I understand this is too much housing. A lot of jurisdictions, communities feel that way. This is a legally mandated state requirement that we have to accommodate 7,000 plus units. It doesn't mean they have to be built, as I've said before, and as I said, some sites will not get built on during the 8-year periods. But the consequences of not having a certified or a substantially in compliance housing element is a very risky business, not just because of the builder's remedy, but also the city could be fined up to $600,000 per month for not having a compliant housing element. And so our goal is to find land, ensure that there's enough land zoned appropriate densities to allow for this development to occur if it should occur. Now, I think it's also really important to note that this is existing zoning. There has been no zoning changes in the housing element. This is housing that could be built today if somebody wanted to. We haven't actually increased the capacity per se on our own, because that's something that Measure Y would prohibit and is part of the GPU update anyway. So this is existing zoning, that we're accommodating these units in existing zoning, that we're not changing any zoning at all. So our task is to make sure that there are enough sites that can accommodate this RENA allocation and provide the necessary tools for developers who want to come in and develop that housing, especially affordable housing. And that's really the goal of what this plan does. I hope that explains it.
Excellent explanation. Thank you. Do you mind explaining to lay people, what does it mean when you say the city is not a builder?
Right. The city doesn't go out and say, we're going to build a building on this site unless it's a site that the city owns, typically. The city is not a developer of housing. What most cities do is they process permits and applications for development on privately held land. The city doesn't require any housing to be built anywhere. And so it's the job of a city to facilitate development. It's not the job of the city to make sure that that development occurs.
Thank you. So we can't, for example, point to a homeowner or a commercial property owner and say, you now have to build up to the maximum capacity.
Right. The decision will always remain with the owner what he or she wants to do with their land. We just are making it possible, if they want a redevelopment, to make it easier for them to do so.
Okay. And you talked a little bit about the repercussions of not having a certified housing element. You mentioned the builder's remedy. You also mentioned the $600,000 potential fine per month.
Right.
And are there other penalties, for example, in terms of eligibility for funding streams?
Right. A lot of the programs that the state offers, including some federal pass-through transportation dollars, are tied to whether or not a jurisdiction has a compliant housing element. If many of the funds that are available for affordable development would not be available if the city did not have a complying housing element.
Right. So, for example, when we look at our most recent, largest affordable housing project, Kiku Crossing, the largest in our history, it would just help for, I think, the community to understand what would that have looked like if we didn't have access to those funding streams?
It wouldn't have been built, actually. I think at this day and age, affordable projects, in my experience of about 30 years of housing development and planning, really, it takes at least 7 to 12 different funding sources for an affordable development to be built. And many times these funding sources are competitive, and a lot of areas lose out on them because they can't meet the criteria and the scoring for them. And so the fact that, I think it was very telling that the fact that Kiku Crossing, the development cost per unit is roughly $760,000 per unit, and that does not include land cost, is telling. It's close to $1 million per unit to develop housing in the Bay Area at this time. So without those funding sources, which the city has some, but it doesn't have $75 million to develop, or $140 million to develop housing. So it requires so many different sources, and it takes a very long time to do.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think a lot of community members, the vast majority of community members in the city of San Mateo, according to our statistically valid polls, have expressed a strong interest and desire for more affordable housing. And so, you know, it's very helpful to hear how the possibility of not having a certified housing element would actually dry up essential funding streams to actually build affordable housing. And then, you know, I think my last question is about better understanding, you know, as the constraints of Measure Y. I'll just read a quick paragraph from the revised version, which states, overall, Measure Y, this is a direct quote from our housing element, overall, the Measure Y is a significant non-governmental constraint to housing production and affordable housing in particular in the city of San Mateo. Building community consensus around the path forward with Measure Y as a part of the general plan update process is essential to meeting the city's current and future housing needs, and to reducing this significant constraint on housing production. I would just ask if you could elaborate more in terms of you know, how the constraints of Measure Y have throttled our ability to actually produce the essential affordable housing that our community is demanding.
I think can I turn it over to you?
Yes. So what we've demonstrated with our housing element for this cycle is that we do have a path forward under Measure Y to meet our regional housing needs allocation plus a buffer of approximately 42%. But what Measure Y does is it does require additional sites. Because the density is capped at 50 units an acre, we need more sites to achieve those housing units. And similarly, we are limited in potentially looking at increasing our inclusionary requirements beyond 15%, because in order to make that economically feasible to require for developers and not be viewed as a barrier to housing production overall, you need to hit minimum densities. And so when we talk about Measure Y as a constraint, those are the metrics that we're looking at. Housing can still be built in this community, but it's at lower densities, so you may not be able to realize the highest and best use of a property because you're only achieving a density up to a point when you maybe, especially for properties near transit, near our Caltrain stations, there's feasibility for densities at 100 or even 200 units an acre, as is explored in our general plan update. And so that's really looking at where these type of densities are appropriate in the city and best utilize the land that we have, which is one of our scarcest resources.
Thank you. And then do you mind speaking to what does that mean exactly in terms of the path forward through the general plan update and how the city will go about adopting a general plan update?
Ultimately, that's what we're looking to facilitate, is a community conversation, building consensus around what the next iteration of Measure Y could look like. And ultimately, it'll be up to the council when you're considering adoption of the general plan, what form that will take. We'll be coming back to you for a study session later this year to discuss how to proceed. We'll be facilitating that discussion when we publish our draft general plan later this spring. And then ultimately, right now we have a draft land use map that does include densities that exceed the Measure Y limits. So there'll need to be a discussion about how you want to handle and move forward with those. And so we'll facilitate that conversation, but at the end of the day, it'll be a decision that'll come back to this council to figure out how you want to move forward with when you're considering adoption of the general plan.
And a question to our city attorney: do you mind just kind of laying out what that looks like from the perspective of legally adopting the general plan via the vote by the voters?
Well, I mean, for those components of the general plan that require a change to Measure Y, just under the California Constitution, any change to Measure Y to any voter initiative must return to the voters in order for them to weigh in on that change.
So potentially looking at a ballot initiative in November 2024.
Well, then just to clarify, it would not be any ballot measure, it would not be in the entire general plan. It would just be on those components, pending direction from the council, of course. Any component that required an amendment to Measure Y, that is what would go to the voters.
I see. And just as a reminder, when we are looking at the horizon of the general plan as a 20-year policy vision, and then the next 2 cycles of the housing element, remind me again the staff's analysis in terms of our development feasibility to meet RENA numbers under the constraints of Measure Y in this cycle versus the next cycle.
The general plan, it basically encompasses 2.5 housing cycles. And so the goal, and this was a large piece of the discussion when we had our alternatives, when we looked at our 3 land use alternatives, was we recognized we needed to plan for future housing cycles since this is a 20-year horizon. So that's really what we did, and that was ultimately the options that we teed up to council when it was time to make a decision on the preferred alternative for both land use and circulation.
Okay, and then just from the city manager perspective, just to kind of put a budget perspective on the potential penalties of $600,000 a month, what would that look like for our budget in terms of the fiscal impacts of penalties over, say, the course of 6 months?
Well, I mean, 6 months at $600,000 a month is $3.6 million. Obviously, that's services that we can't provide if we're paying $600,000 a month. I mean, we have healthy reserves, but so could we absorb that for a while? Certainly, but would I ever recommend absorbing $600,000 a month in penalties that we could avoid? Right, that's opportunity cost for services. So it's a big issue with a budget of our size to even contemplate $600,000 a month in penalties.
Yeah, seems like a lot of money. And so $600,000 a month. That's actually kind of like the cost of a special election too, right? Is that right, City Clerk?
In 1 or 2 months, yes.
Yes. Okay, those are my questions. So at this point, does anyone else have any follow-up questions? Okay, Councilmember Hedges.
This question is about grants from agencies if we don't have a certified housing element. And just let me give you something from OBAG. So I got this off their website. Local compliance requires the TIP programming. Sponsors awarded OBAG 3 county and local program funding must have their projects added or amended in the Transportation Improvement Program. Applicable requirements include a certified housing element. I'm asking this for a reason. I was notified that there's a pending 3.2.
I appreciate your interest in politics, but it's not a part of my program.
And I've got the microphone cut off, so I don't know how that happened. So that was a complaint for somebody. We're talking too much politics. Sorry, I have no control over Siri. So my question is, if this $3.2 million grant, which is for infrastructure actually in District 4, would be in danger if we don't have a certified housing element?
Do you want to answer that? It depends on, I think it depends on where it is in the process. If we don't have it, and let's say, if there's already movement on it, I don't think anything that is currently in the pipeline would necessarily be in danger, but any new projects, definitely.
Okay.
If there's no other questions from council, we will open public comment. Madam Clerk.
Thank you. In person, we have 12 speaker slips. On the Zoom call, if you intend to make public comment on this item, if you could please raise your hand now so we can get an accurate count of how many people want to comment. Thank you. I see a lot of hands going up. We're up to 16 already, so we've exceeded our 20 count. So our usual protocol is to do 1 minute Does council concur? Okay, so we will have timing for 1 minute. I'm going to call up the first speakers. We're going to call them 3 at a time. If you can come and line up against the wall here on the right so we can be efficient in getting to the microphone, that would be great. Can you, so I'll call up the first 3 speakers. Please finish raising your hands online. After the first speaker, we will call out who the last speaker will be. The first 3 speakers, the first one is Kenna Brew, followed by Daniel Sheffen, then Edward Evans.
Good evening, and thank you. Today I'll be speaking on behalf of the Sustainable Land Use Committee of the Sierra Club. We sent a letter in, which hopefully you all got to take a look at. And in my 1 minute here, I'd just like to emphasize a few key points. One of our key points is we're very concerned about the lack of affordable housing in San Mateo. We're way behind. It has a huge impact environmentally as well as economically and on our community. So it's important that this housing element and the general plan move ahead in a very positive way to make more housing buildable. We know that, as your consultant says, the city can't build it, but the city can reduce the hurdles to doing that. In our letter, we point out several different things we think you can do to reduce those hurdles and to maximize that ability to build that affordable housing. We're going to have to be creative. We're going to have to make hard decisions. Please do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Online, we have 23 hands raised. So at this time, we are identifying who the 23 speakers remotely will be. The very last speaker will be Peter Mandel. So we have 23 speakers online. And the next speaker in person is Daniel Sheffer, followed by Edward Evans, and then Michael Reagan. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you. 3 comments quickly. One, because of the timing, the city's now with it over a barrel. And I don't think anybody's happy about it. And I request that either the city manager or the mayor, whoever, make sure that we're not forced to decisions at the last minute next time. The second comment is I urge you to approve the plan because I don't think anybody wants to be forced into the builder's got the word. And the third comment is that in light of the Planning Commission, the Building Commission's decision to reject the plan, and what I understand to be, at least in my opinion, inappropriate behavior in front of the State Planning Commission, I urge the City Council to revisit who is on that commission and to consider personnel changes. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Edward Evans, followed by Michael Reagan, and then Tom Leese.
Good evening. I don't have a lot of time here to say what I need to say. I just want to point out that in the current housing element, there really are no protections for local labor. That's a real concern. I wrote a 3-page letter. The Carpenters Union submitted a 3-page letter this past May 14th. It seems to have just fallen on deaf ears. It was 3 pages of education on the importance of labor standards here in our city. Carpentry, all things being equal, carpentry being carpentry, it's just not right for certain men and women to be working on one side of our city on commercial projects or even on prevailing wage projects like Kiku Crossing that you've mentioned tonight. And they're making almost $60 an hour plus another $24, $25 in fringe benefits. And then there's this other cadre of workers that are brought in on these private residential projects, and they're not being paid enough to live here. They're barely being paid enough to survive. It's not right. There should be at least a few sentences in here to protect construction workers working in our city, in our community. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Edward Evans, followed by Michael Reagan, and then Tom Leese. Oh, that was Edward. I'm sorry, me first?
Okay.
Followed by Ted McKinnon. Go ahead, please.
Could you start me over again, please?
Yep.
Thank you. Great job, staff. Just want to say, I was just elected president of the Beresford Hillsdale Homeowners Association, and I take that job quite seriously. We sent a letter to you guys, council, and to Adam, and we do support the current housing element. I think it's important that we get it done tonight. I also want to say to Mayor Lee that Measure Y was passed by the citizens of San Mateo over the objection of this past city council and the excessive amount of money that was spent to defeat it. And I think that it needs to be implemented and to the best of your ability to enforce it with this plan. Thank you.
Thank you. And to clarify, the next speaker is Tom Lees, followed by Carol Eldridge, and then Ted McKinnon.
Hi. Thank you guys for the amazing work you did in putting that document together. And I think, I believe that we should go forward with that document and then work on the society we're living in now is we're faced with, low wages and the 1% doubled their wealth during the pandemic. And now we're in this situation where we're all fighting, but we're all on the same side. So this is a great housing document. Let's pass it and then work on the other things, because the builder's remedy is not a builder's remedy. It's an investor's casino. And the thing is that there's one sentence in that plan that said the gold standard is when the investor or the owner wants the property. Well, the gold standard should be affordable and workforce housing and community benefit. So let's do that.
Thank you. The next speaker is Carol Eldridge, followed by Ted McKinnon, and then Mitch Spiegel.
Good evening. I speak this evening on behalf of One San Mateo. I came to express some concerns about the housing element, especially from the perspective of affirmatively furthering fair housing. The housing element does very little to advance affordable housing in neighborhoods that are affluent and predominantly white. In fact, there are no programs that support low-income housing or very low-income housing in these areas. So this is a definite deficit in the housing element. We're also dismayed at the timeline attached to policies listed under AFFH. The policies to close loopholes in the substantial renovations provisions of AB 1482 have been put off to 2025 and 2026. The thought of waiting 2 or 3 additional years to put these policies into place is very troubling. There are renters who will inevitably be taken advantage of and hurt during this time. And so whether it's through the housing element process or some other method, we encourage you to move more swiftly on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Ted McKinnon, followed by Mitch Spiegel, then Jeff Lamont.
Good evening. I'd like to second the remarks that have been made about the timetable for closing loopholes under the Tenant Protection Act, known as AB 1482. As part of the housing element process, there was a large amount of community outreach done. One of the needs that was articulated most often and most forcefully during these outreach meetings was the need to prevent evictions. A good bit of work has been already done, both by community members and by staff, on ways to close loopholes in state law and keep people in their homes. If we as a community truly care about the most vulnerable among us, then we should not put off these policies. If you approve the housing element this evening, please advance the timetable for these policies as a condition of doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mitch Spiegel, followed by Jeff Lamont, and then Dennis Keene.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for the time. I appreciate it. I live in District 5, Adams District. Only a minute, so I'm going to be brief. I heard from the housing staff that we had to make some changes regarding affirmatively forwarding fair housing, and we made the decision to add these policies. I would ask, who's we? I urge everyone to read the actual public response sections, rental restrictions and increases to increase rent control here in San Mateo, We're not even in the top 5 of needs cited in the public responses. The people want affordable housing. Even in the 21 Elements Focus Study, the only people asking for these are rental advocacy groups, large affordable housing. That was a minute? Oh, 4 seconds. I think we should push back. A minute's a crazy time to kind of be up here and talk about this, but I think we should have more discussion, and I'm unfortunate that we're in this position.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Jeff Lamont, followed by Dennis Keene, and then Fernando Pena.
Thank you, Council. My first question is, why did we wait until this week to have this meeting? This meeting should have been done a week ago. Staff is indicating that we can't make any changes without going back, I guess, for public comments for another week. It's ridiculous. This meeting should have happened a week ago. So that's my first comment. My second comment is I urge you to remove the expanded tenant protections and rental registry from the housing elements. Contrary to what staff is trying to imply, these measures are not required by the state of California. Specifically, I'm talking about items number 7.2.3, goal H3, and policy number H3.4 and policy H3.6, extended tenant protections and evaluate rental registry options. These are huge policy decisions, and these should not be pushed through on the housing element. These items should be discussed between the council and between the constituents in this city. They should not be railroaded through on the housing element. Thank you.
Next speaker is Dennis Keene, followed by Fernando Pena, and then Karen O'Creen. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you. I just wanted to add my voice to those recommending we send this proposal in, and I'm a little perplexed that anyone would suggest that we stop our iterative process with HCD and send nothing in. I'm a little concerned how that helps us maintain community autonomy and some control over our community. To give that away by not submitting this seems to be a real error. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Fernando Pena, followed by Kareem Suart.
Good evening, Mayor Lee and council members. My name is Fernando Pena. I'm the Government Affairs Director with the San Mateo County Association of Realtors. While we are aware of the importance of passing the housing element tonight, we just wanted to respectfully respond to staff. We were originally concerned about how the tenant protections, expanded tenant protections, and the rent registry were included in this document. But since your conversation this evening, we respectfully disagree that on the AFFH and AB 686, those are strictly guidelines for our communities. And we're respectfully requesting additional conversations with staff and with the council. We appreciate the opportunity to work with you moving forward on our concerns with these expanded rent control measures. Thank you.
Thank you, and Kareem, and thank you for the pronunciation help.
I'm an ADU builder. While the housing element has a lot of good intentions, it contradicts itself when it goes into expanding tenant protections and becomes counterintuitive. The housing element outlines goals to build 400 plus ADUs within a certain amount of time, but then talks about expanding tenants' rights, which always translates to restrictions to landlords and property owners, and the restrictions will inhibit permit applications. Financing and the permitting process is already a daunting task to homeowners who want to build an ADU on their property. My recommendation on behalf of tens of thousands of single-family homeowners is to delete section 7.2.3 completely. Thank you. And I took the Evelyn Woodhead Spit reading course. Thank you.
Thank you. We're moving to the remote commenters now. Our first speaker online is Allie Sapperman. Please go ahead, Allie.
Good evening, Allie Saperman on behalf of the Housing Action Coalition. We submitted a letter explaining why we think your housing element is not yet ready. It includes unrealistic sites, it overestimates capacities, and it picks and chooses data. It's bad enough that your planning commission has told you it does not comply with state housing law. Our letter goes into detail, but I'd like to call one example to make sure you understand how the law applies here. For sites that where there is an existing use, you need to make a specific finding that the use is likely to discontinue during the next 8 years. HCD says they look for evidence that tenants have already made plans to move out. At the Bridgepoint site, you have the opposite. You have new leases from large retailers that have been signed for 6, 7, 8 more years. And if staff makes the argument that landlords can break leases, they can buy people out. But as far as we know, no one in staff has actually asked about these leases and how much they would cost and whether or not that's realistic. Without evidence, you can't count this 22-acre site. That's one issue. The second issue is that Bridgepoint is more than 10 acres, and a site more than 10 acres presumed not to be realistic for an affordable housing developer. I know you're conscious of the deadline, but it would be better to be late than to be told by HCD or a court that you violated the law. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The next speaker is Rick Bonilla.
Thank you for this opportunity. The housing element is overly optimistic on the number of units that it plans to derive from the sites that are laid out. HCD told the city to use estimates of historical production to base future production. We have not historically had 100% of capacity used or approved. Regarding the general plan, the housing element is again overly optimistic because if it's approved, it could bring 21,000 units over the next 20 years, but that's only if increases in height and density are approved by a vote of the public. Regarding ADUs, I looked at the numbers that were shown, and I see that more than 25% of those applications from last year were not approved. There may be some mitigating factors there, I don't know, but that's a disincentive to homeowners to apply. The bar is a little high. I think it's overly difficult. A recession could really greatly depress this. The city's running out of publicly owned land. We have very little left. The housing element is inadequate. It's not fully responsive to HCD. I agree with PC Planning Commission's 4-point recommendation to not adopt the housing element. I believe that whether City Council adopts or not will be deemed out of compliance, and the Planning Commission is not the problem.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, former mayor.
Okay, I found this on the web for ACD told the city to use estimates of historical production to base future production.
Rick, we can still hear you.
Thank you, goodbye. That was Siri again.
We're still hear you. Okay.
The next speaker is Ronnie Eaton.
Hi, good evening. I'm a San Mateo resident, and it's very clear from the summary presentation made by the city staff tonight that an incredible amount of work has gone into the revision of the San Mateo housing element in order to meet all of the concerns and comment received from HCD. It's also apparent that the city staff addressed all the concerns of the Planning Commission, who has urged the council not to approve our element. It's come to light that an individual on the Planning Commission contacted the state HCD and claimed that a housing element plan is insufficient. This individual acted outside the public forum and the city council and apparently feels that they can offend the public process and push their own agenda over and above every person in the city. This is outrageous behavior and cannot be condoned by anyone who lives in San Mateo. The housing element was amended to address previous concerns and questions put forth by HCD, and it is an iterative process. We want to see the council approve our current housing element plans so this city can move forward. The council must now show its support for the public's input and approve the plan. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mariva Godfrey.
Hi, good evening. So I'm also in favor of approving and adopting this plan. It's not a good idea to hand over control and autonomy of decision-making to any third party. And there are too many other fiscal consequences at play here. It is the 11th and a half hour. And also a very dedicated team of members of the public and staff have worked over 2 years in writing and amending the housing element to its current version that is compliant with state requirements. I heard clearly that this is essentially a working document subject to, revision and improvement and reiteration. And therefore, please adopt this and let's move on everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Lisa Tanner.
I'm a District 5 resident and not a paid lobbyist. Good evening. Council, you have a critical decision to make with decades-long impact. Residents have urged you not to miss the state deadline, especially considering comments tonight that we still have openings for clarifying changes. Councilmember Lorraine, you're new to District 5, so we've certainly shared that as the birthplace of Measure Y, our district has historical concerns with developer overreach, loss of local control, and protections of character of our city. Council, frankly, a rejection, pausing a missed deadline to allow more leeway to developers, including ignoring Measure Y, which, by the way, introduced affordable housing requirements in San Mateo. Along with hefty monthly fines by HCD, a rejection would fail residents and our city. Tonight, we don't need another recallammolead.com website and effort. What we need is to be truly represented. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Lisa Van de Voorde.
Hi, good evening. I'm Lisa Van de Voorde, and I'm speaking tonight to urge you to approve the housing element as recommended by staff. The revised housing element presented tonight addresses all changes requested by HCD and is compliant. However, I'd like to go on the record to say that I do not support any strategy to bring Measure Y back for a citywide vote. This housing element meets RHNA cycle numbers without overturning Measure Y. I too wonder why rental restrictions were shoehorned into the document, and hope that in the future the community can weigh in on things like the rental registry and other concerns. Finally, I strongly disagree with the Planning Commission's recommendation to deny the housing element and their statements regarding the element's compliance. The result is builders' remedy, with developers riding roughshod over this city. One must wonder why the Planning Commission is okay with that. It's unacceptable to me and should be unacceptable to you. The reins are in your hands. I ask you to please take control and submit this HCD compliant housing element. Thank you.
Next speaker is Andrea. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm a District 5 resident, and I agree with several that have spoken that the state deadlines have to be met. The council should accept the housing element as originally submitted. We've had several dedicated groups working on this for over 2 years. And I also want to add that I do not want to have developers to be able to pay in lieu fees instead of delivering on the promises of what they have said they were going to build when we gave away the ability, the land, anything to create more housing, whether it be below market rate, low cost housing, anything. Your acceptance of in lieu fees is just horrible. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Martha Park.
I would like to request that you accept the draft housing element prepared by staff. I'm concerned that our city won't come up with a final plan by January 31st and we'll lose what local control we have. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Robert Whitehair.
Do you want to restart the clock? There you go. Good evening, council and staff. Thank you for taking the committed time over the last couple of years to put together a housing element. And special thanks to the new council members who have spent so much time coming up to a quick speed on what these issues are. I do agree with the Planning Commission thinking. I do not agree with their outcome. The housing element needs to be submitted to the state as soon as possible to avoid builder's remedy. But I take it this way. By submitting it now, you do provide a 60-day reprieve, during which time the city has a chance to bring all the parties together to work on the issues that brought us to where we are now. And I would add that Measure Y lost by 46 votes last time. Things are changing. I think it's everybody's best interest to work this out over the next 60 days so we have a solution that will provide us a housing element that will satisfy our housing needs and satisfy all the other competing interests of San Mateo. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. The next speaker is Daniel Shore.
Yes, hi, this is Daniel Shore, and thank you for taking my call. I'm just want to say that you please approve the housing element. We need to maintain local control and not be fined by the state. The fact that some council members seem to be entertaining a no vote is kind of unthinkable. Please do not vote no, vote yes, and get this housing element submitted by the deadline. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. The next speaker is Francis Souza.
Yes, good evening. I'm a resident of Central San Mateo, and I'm also urging the council to please adopt the housing element plan as presented tonight and let us maintain control over our city's housing plans. I don't want it to turn over to the builder's remedy. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Connie W.
Hi, I'm a proud resident of San Mateo for over 35 years. I thank the city staff in putting together a plan that is compliant with state requirements and keeps in mind the voters' mandate of Measure Y. I urge City Council to approve this plan as presented tonight with the staff modifications, and also urge Council to take action on reining in the 3 planning commissioners who voted that this proposal be denied because they are beholden to special interests and developers and do not take into consideration the wishes of residents at all. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is George. Please go ahead, George.
Yes, hi. I've seen that there's been quite a bit of discussion about locating funding for affordable housing, but not too much discussion about the actual cost structure of providing that housing. With that Kiku, there was the mention that at Kiku Crossing, the construction per unit is about over $750,000 per unit. I'm guessing that's north of $500 a square foot. If that money is going to the individual skills trades, maybe that's okay, but nobody really seems to know or nobody seems to care. What I'm suggesting as a starting point is that the city, for the housing that it owns and is involved in, create a build cost spreadsheet that links to every single invoice and payment and bank transfer that occurs during the construction of that housing. I mean, at Kiku Crossing, if you walk by, that's a slab build. They're sheathing, not plywood. It's very interesting how these numbers add up. And this could be a model for many, many other things. You cut down corruption, you get many more of your goals fulfilled.
Thank you. The next speaker is Rick Sakuda. Rick, can you unmute yourself?
I'm sorry. Rick Sakuda, proud resident for 30 years. I want to thank staff and all the individuals that have worked so hard on this project. It's been over 2 years, and with the outreach we've had, I think everybody has had a chance to weigh in. And this element has been discussed, reviewed, submitted, amended, and beat up by community groups, city staff, and the state of California. We'll never be able to build 100% consensus around this, but everyone has had a chance to weigh in. I can't understand how at the 11th hour there is a move to possibly disapprove it and leave our city open to state sanctions, builder's remedy, and a $600,000 a month penalty. It's time to move on and approve the housing element that so many people have worked so hard for. There are still valid issues that require further discussion. There's time for that. We can't have yet another embarrassing incident that makes the evening news. Thank you all for your hard work on this.
Next speaker is Robin Gage.
Hi, I'm Robin Gage. I'm a resident of District 3. I would like the council to accept the current housing element. The city staff and residents have been working on this for over 2 years. Residents have provided input for this element of the general plan, which exceeds the mandated housing goal. Both staff and the many participating residents should be heard and represented. Residents need to have assurance that the city council is acting in good faith as it works with its residents to develop policy. We've been working hard to avoid the loss of local control and relied on you to lead us through the general plan. Please listen to your constituents, move San Mateo into the future, and accept the updated draft of the housing element. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Jordan Grimes.
Good evening, Council. Honorable Mayor Jordan Grimes, lifelong San Mateo resident. It's very disappointing the Council is even in the position of considering the adoption of this draft of the element tonight, given the numerous statutory deficiencies in the sites inventory, constraints analyses, and AFFH analyses. The element does not come close to meeting HCD standards. The adoption is being made in bad faith, plain and simple. The city is adopting an element you know is not compliant with state law, which you readily admit is going to require more discussion with HCD. The process is not iterative at this point. The element is due by January 31st. If you wanted to avoid penalties, you should have been making genuine substantive changes and having these conversations with HCD months ago. We are getting the builder's remedy regardless of what happens tonight. The only real decision to make is whether we want to start working toward a real compliant plan now or later post-litigation. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Jacqueline.
Yes, hello, this is Michael on Jacqueline's computer. 3 comments. 1, a number of the sites mentioned have been on city property, which means it belongs to the taxpayers and citizens of San Mateo. I hope that land is sold to developers at fair market value and the money returned to the city so there's not more of an economic burden by this project. Number 2, I understand that this project is needed and mandated by law. Someone mentioned it would improve the quality of life. I don't see how adding more housing units and therefore more people to the city of San Mateo and increasing traffic is going to improve anybody's quality of life. And third, the reason we have this problem in San Mateo in the Bay Area is because there are too many people. And that's because city councils across the Bay are so pro-development that anything that's economic development is viewed as good when it isn't. And I hope any future developments that come before this council that you will consider the impact that more people will have on this project and on the quality of life in San Mateo.
Thank you. The next speaker is Angelina Soldados.
Thank you, Mayor Lee and San Mateo City Council for this special meeting. My name is Angelina Soldatos, and I'm with the California Apartment Association. Our organization represents rental housing owners and operators in San Mateo County. We acknowledge and appreciate how city officials have worked tirelessly on this housing element, ensuring equitable housing accessibility for all members of San Mateo. We support policies for housing that is much needed for the city of San Mateo. We strongly advise the council to be cautious when committing the entire city to adopting guidelines as policy because of pressure from HCD without full outreach and a proper public policy process. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Lori.
Hi, council members. I appreciate the hard work that's been done on this plan, and I urge you to adopt the housing element tonight because we're out of time. It's not perfect, but it has to be adopted tonight so we don't have the draconian consequence of the builder's remedy. I'm not a paid lobbyist, but I want to say that I don't think that everything in this document is perfect, but if we don't approve it tonight, we'll have much worse consequences. And I also want to point out that we need housing, but it's at the expense of the quality of life of our citizens that have been here for a long time. We're all losing the amenities that we've enjoyed, and it's being lost to housing. Good or bad, please adopt the policy, the element tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to call out that we have 4 remaining speakers. Rovi Lynn Antonio is next, followed by Paul Boudreau. Then Peter Mandel is our last speaker. The people who have raised their hands since we ended the queue, we will be ending our public comment, our remote public comment with Peter Mandel. Thank you. Go ahead, Rovi.
Good evening, Mayor Lee, members of the council. Rovi Antonio with the California Apartment Association. The housing element is an important document to ensure that cities accommodate the growth of housing and housing opportunities. CAA fully supports its goal. What is equally important is for the city to also look at existing housing stock and ensure that laws are not being proposed that would discourage housing providers to continue providing housing. Much like how policies in the housing element identify strategies to remove barriers to building new housing, the housing element must also remove barriers that would make maintaining housing problematic, burdensome, or a liability. The current version of policy H3.4 and H6 duplicate what is already state law and installs barriers and constraints to maintaining housing and service liabilities. CAA does not support proposals to make laws such as 1482 stricter when the law was never given time to fully be implemented. CEA supports your commitment to prevent displacement, and one way to achieve that is by implementing 1482 and what Governor Newsom heralded as the strongest tenant protection in the country. We look forward to the opportunities and the shots to amend certain policy adjustments in the document as confirmed by city staff and Mayor Lee, that this is not set in stone. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Paul Boudreau.
Good evening. My name is Paul Boudreau. I'm a resident of San Mateo and a member of SAMCAR. I understand the amount of hard work that staff and the city council has put into this draft and the time crunch that we're in. And overall, I am in support of this housing element. However, I am extremely concerned about the portion of the housing element regarding rental restrictions, which increases AB 1482 restrictions. This will make it harder for mom and pop landlords like my parents to do business. And by the way, these mom and pop landlords are the current and true low income housing suppliers. And if these restrictions are increased, they will exit the market and there'll be a lot of unintended consequences. I mean, furthermore, it goes without saying that this is an extremely complicated issue. I think in order to simplify it, we need to separate creating the discussion of creating more housing and how to do that and regulating the current supply. Don't make this more complicated than it is. Thank you.
Thank you. And our last speaker is Peter Mandel.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and even if I am the last speaker. Three things. Number one, I'd like to urge the city council to approve the housing element as recommended by city staff while reserving the ability to amend the policies as they may choose as part of a response to subsequent HCD comment and avoid the builder's remedy. Pass it tonight, please. Secondly, I want to thank the staff, just like others have, for their hard work over these last 2 years. I don't know how many public meetings, how many revisions, but they've ended up with a clear and comprehensive and thorough responses to each of the state's comments. Thank you. Thirdly, I'm confused why the City Planning Commission wasn't able to meet with city staff to iron out their concerns or questions about capacity, goals, and policies, and why over these many months they didn't resolve them together and instead saying they objected to the plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That is our last speaker.
Thank you to everyone who called in and showed up and who is still here. So with that, we will close public comment, and this is a time for remarks. Would anyone like to begin? I had a clarifying question if nobody wants to jump in right now. I want to clarify for the public and for our council as well, even if the council adopts the housing element for submittal tonight, that can you clarify where that puts us in terms of the potential of the builder's remedy?
By adopting the housing element tonight, along with the resolutions and the attachments that include the detailed list of everything required in housing element law and where that particular statutory requirement is in the housing element, you are demonstrating to the state that we believe we have a compliant housing element, and that we believe that we have addressed every statutory issue. And so, as I mentioned before, it's still unclear because this is all new territory within the Bay Area, whether or not, first of all, whether a builder's remedy project would come in immediately, or whether the city could argue, potentially in a legal situation, argue that it is in compliance and that builder's remedy does not apply. It's essentially making a statement that we believe we are in compliance and that that builder's remedies would not apply. That again, that's the area is gray as to what will actually happen. A lot of cities have the same concern you do, and until we actually follow through and submit the adopted housing element, we won't know exactly what will happen.
Thank you for clarifying that. So just to kind of bottom line it for the community. So there's no such thing as self-certification. The only certification that can happen is through HCD, correct?
Right.
Okay, so then that means that that HCD is going to be the determining agency about certification. And even if the housing element is adopted tonight by council, that in no way is a guarantee that, that we won't still be subject to the builder's remedy. Is that clear to everyone in the room? Is that clear to you? Yeah, so do you mind speaking into the mic?
That is certainly an option that could happen.
So I just want that to be really explicit in terms of, you know, us not knowing, not having clarity, legal clarity. This is a gray area and an untested legal territory in terms of, you know, where we are in this process and what the potential penalties could be. And that also technically could include the financial penalties or even the funding eligibility.
Those items, to my understanding, I don't know if Prasanna wants to weigh in on that.
Yeah, just through the mayor, I would summarize this as if the council adopts the housing element tonight, it puts the city in a more protective position, because what it does is it allows the city to deny certain specified housing developments if it's inconsistent with both the general plan and the zoning ordinance, where we can take the position and reasonably and substantially argue that the housing element has been adopted in accordance with state law. Because the builder's remedy, it's part of the Housing Accountability Act, and where a city has not adopted a housing element that substantially complies with state law, that removes the ability to deny certain types of housing developments. So conversely, if you have a housing element that does substantially comply with state law, then that gives you that option to have more local control over housing development projects.
Okay, so I mean, I appreciate the explanation. It doesn't really change the situation of being in a gray area without real, there's no guarantee unless we have certification.
You know, this is an area, as Diana mentioned, that cities across the Bay Area and across the state are facing. So we'll have to see how those ongoing conversations with HCD develop, and how the development community and housing advocacy groups kind of interact with that process. So it's still a developing area in this housing element cycle.
Thank you. And so, and for the purposes of just moderating this conversation and the scope of this conversation, if staff's recommendation is that we, we move forward with adopting the current the current amended version of the housing element. But also, I hear from some council members that there's a desire to continue conversation about opportunities for, iteration, right, and prioritization. How do you suggest that we structure that conversation? Is that something that we would address tonight through deliberation, or would that come back to us at a future study session?
I would suggest that it come back at a future study session. I think before you tonight is the draft as it's presented. And as I mentioned before, we do intend to have continuing conversations with HCD. We know already how they commented on the draft that we had presented to them. We know that this is a different council than saw the draft before. We want to make sure that we have a full and informed conversation. And I think we're only getting more and more information from HCD as more and more cities submit their draft housing elements for certification. And so I think as time goes by, we do get more and more information from them. You know, as we've said, we do believe that this is a compliant housing element. And so we want to be careful that we continue to have one, and that any changes that we have that come to us in the future continue to be compliant. And I think the more information that we get from the state, we will have a better chance of any changes that we submit to them continuing to be compliant as we get more information from them. And so I would want to be careful of getting a lot of feedback tonight that may take us away from that. And so I think when we have more information to bring to you from them, then you guys can shape your comments accordingly. So I would hate to have a situation where we get a lot of direction that maybe is going off in a different direction from HCD. And so I think it might be better to have a little bit of time in between now and then so that you guys can shape your conversation and make sure that it's not going off in a direction that we can't take you where you want to get to.
Thank you, that's clear. So I think that, I hopefully that will help us kind of understand what the bounds of this conversation and decision point is for tonight. It sounds like there may be interest across some of the council members to hold, agendize a future study session. I totally appreciate, you're new to the conversation out on the council and want your fingerprint on it as well. That makes a lot of sense. So I think that for the purposes of tonight, I would open it up for remarks from council, understanding the bounds of scope for the decision. Who wants to go first? Councilmember Hedges, first to go.
New guy. So I will make it clear to everybody that I don't want a builder's remedy, but I want to put you a little bit at ease because I'm seeing projects that have begun and are now partially built and laying fallow. I've seen projects, know of one in a neighborhood that's been approved and now is out of contract with the landowners and will not be built. So there are several projects that have been approved, some for several years, and are going nowhere. And that is issue of money. And when I talk to the developers, they can't get the money they need. So I don't think we're going to, in the short run, have to worry about that, at least to no great extent. The other thing I want to know, and it hasn't been clear to me, is if we see deficiencies or things that we'd like to change, and we bring them up at the blue sky process, will we have an opportunity to change those things? That's a question.
So if you set a goal for us, and it's something that ends up in our work plan, then you absolutely will have an opportunity to change those things. I mean, if something ends up in our work plan, then we are absolutely going to bring it to you, and that's going to be something that we're going to implement. So if it ends up in our work plan, then it's something that becomes a marching order for us, and we will return to you for guidance, and we'll implement that.
So when it comes to policy, how about redactions or additions?
If you give us something to implement into our work plan, regardless of what that is, if it is a marching order from the city council, we will bring that to you.
Thank you.
Can I clarify something to the mayor about that last discussion? So there is the blue sky process for the council to, instruct staff as to its strategic priorities. We also have, the housing element, has been discussed, the process has been discussed at length. I don't want to create the impression that you can use the blue sky process to amend the housing element, because that's not the case.
Yeah, I think if I could add to that through the mayor, as I believe Zach mentioned earlier, a council policy does not have to be a part of the housing element, right? So if there's policy direction, it does not have to necessarily be embedded in the housing element. I think the point that we want to be clear on is we can't create a process, or we can't create a policy outside of the housing element that's in conflict with the housing element that we've submitted.
We do need your microphones turned on.
Would anyone else like to make comments in terms of your support or not for this version of the housing element? Councilmember Lorraine.
Thank you. Okay, I would like to start by quickly thanking the public for attending, for giving comments live or on Zoom, sending a number of letters, and for overall being a part of the process, whether it was today or earlier throughout the multiple years of this process. I'd like to thank staff for the time and effort over those number of public meetings described earlier and tonight into making this draft housing element. I'll cut to the chase by just saying I am in favor of adopting tonight as staff presented and with the staff revisions. But I also just wanted to mention that I appreciate and understand to some extent the position of the Planning Commission and of housing advocates who are concerned that this draft doesn't do enough to affirmatively further fair housing, that it doesn't do enough to make the case that the city can reasonably expect to meet our regional housing needs allocation. Indeed, that it may not do enough to earn HCD certification for these reasons and more. But to paraphrase what Robert Whitehair mentioned in public comment earlier today, I may share some of these concerns, but I don't agree with the overall recommendation. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay for a city council's planning commission to give a recommendation based on the work that they've put in, which is a tremendous amount of work in itself. And for the city council to take that into consideration and then potentially make a different decision after that. That said, we are 1 week from this January 31st deadline. We've discussed a bit about the limitations that presents us. To protect us as much from the builder's remedy as possible at this point and other consequences for not submitting, I believe it's in the best interest of the city to submit the current draft as proposed and hopefully continue something of an iterative process with ACD towards certification and compliance as soon as possible. I would just request and expect that staff continue to work with ACD in between submittal and response, as they mentioned they intend to do, and that staff share HCD's response with council as soon as possible, and bring an item to council as soon as possible if the city is not certified, so that council can collaborate with staff and the consultant on next steps in the interest of making changes necessary to earn certification as soon as possible. Those are my comments.
I'm going to cut to the chase. I don't think I could set it better than Adam did, so I'm going to leave it at that. But say that not only do I appreciate what the Planning Commission did, but I appreciate what other industries have said that have been here. And it's just unfortunate that we don't have the time right now to explore it. Thank you.
Once again, thank you to everyone who put this together, to the past council who worked so hard on it, my colleagues, and everyone who's commented from the public. I guess, in addition to what everyone else had said, I am too going to be recommending that we approve the housing element tonight. But I just want to step back for a second and say that after much work and so much extensive community outreach and discussion, let's think about the opportunity this housing element in our general plan offers us. We can use this and plan for the future San Mateo we all want. It's bigger than how many housing units we get. Affordable housing, 15-minute neighborhoods, open space, labor protection, increased diversity and equity, everything that everyone has talked about. This is an opportunity that our housing element, rooted in our general plan, can afford us. I also very much support Mayor Lee's suggestion that we use our February 11th Blue Sky session to continue these discussions. They don't have to be in the housing element. They shouldn't be in conflict, but there's so much we can do in that session, and I think she's very right to bring that up. We all have so much to learn. I have tried myself to speak with as many groups and individuals as I could, with the Sierra Club, with the Housing Leadership Council, with individual commissioners, with neighborhood associations, with CAA and SAMCAR. I've heard so much, but I've also heard from so many of my constituents, and we all have heard from so many people across the city, strong support for approving this draft housing element. And while I very much respect the debate that occurred during the recent Planning Commission and acknowledge that their ultimate recommendation to deny the approval of this housing element is their prerogative, I respectfully disagree with their conclusion, as many of us have said. There's lots I want to see for what we can do, but I'm convinced by staff's work and that we have a solid way forward to achieve our RHNA and our best shot. Therefore, I will vote for the resolution to approve the draft housing element, including the proposed modifications made by staff tonight. And I look forward to continuing to have this discussion and to staff working with HCD, as Councilmember Lorraine has said so well, to resolve any final issues quickly so that we can keep moving forward on our general plan timeline and the big picture of what we can implement that all San Mateans can be proud of. Thank you.
I don't really have much to add. It kind of feels like either we're going to do this or it's a nuclear option, and I'm not willing to accept the nuclear option. Is the document perfect? No. Is there things in it that I wish weren't in it? Yes. Is there things in it that are the things not in it that I wish were? Yes. But I'm confident that our staff has spent over a year and a half creating this document, and if they tell us that they think it's going to get through HCD, then I'm going to put my faith in them. And of course, I echo everyone's sentiment of if HCD does have concerns, I hope that that's brought to our attention right away so we can remedy them and not be subjected to $600,000 a month fine, because we certainly need that money for other things. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Well, I'm very encouraged by the sentiments of the council. I agree, this is the 11th hour, and I think that we have to keep moving forward. So I will be supporting the adoption of this version. I'm glad that we're contemplating opening up for other conversations through, future study sessions, as well as the Blue Skies. All of us, I think, have an obligation to consider the many ways that we need to support community and really come to the table about our responsibility in terms of land use and supporting the community's vision of San Mateo. So with that, I will call for a motion.
I move to support and approve the current housing element before us tonight.
And I second that motion.
Can I clarify the motion? Is it the staff recommendation as
Yes.
articulated in the staff report?
Yes, as amended.
As amended by staff to include the supplemental sites inventory?
What you said.
Okay.
Right, and I second that.
Councilmember Hedges.
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Diaz-Nash.
Yes.
Councilmember Lorraine.
Yes.
Councilmember Newsome.
Yes.
Mayor Lee.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. So before we adjourn, and we don't typically do announcements, but I did want to share with the community that I had the very heartfelt honor of sitting with some of the survivors of the Half Moon Bay shooting that occurred yesterday. And so I spent the afternoon with our Chinese community members. They were, they were very well supported by community. They were, the county has stepped up in many ways to provide them income support for lost wages because they cannot work. They cannot return to their home because they were living on the farm where the incident occurred. So they are currently being put up in hotels. And the condition of their homes was very concerning, and I believe the county is also looking at where there may be opportunities for some more longer term or potentially permanent affordable housing options. And it's really opened up a lot of visibility and need around mental health, around gun control, and I wanted to just share with you that as terrifying and sickening as the experience was, and the chance to sit with them as they, cried in my arms, as they felt numb, and one of the men, he actually, was so overwhelmed that he could barely keep his eyes open. They're so sleep deprived. They haven't had a single night's sleep since it happened. And through it, I think they're feeling very supported and not alone. And it's because of the response from our community. And I just want to give credit to the leadership coming out of the nonprofits that are stepping up and supporting them, as well as our county manager, Mike Callaghy, who actually came and spoke with them, as well as our governor, Gavin Newsom, who showed up and sat with the survivors. And everyone asked, what can I do? How can I help you? And I think that there's a lot of immediate needs in terms of getting through the crisis at hand, but also there's a lot of long-term needs that need attention and resources for our farm workers. And so, and for our API community, frankly. This is a time where many of our API community members have been suffering silently, subject to racism and discrimination and hate. And there's been incredible job loss and shuttered businesses that have disproportionately impacted the API community during the pandemic. There's been a mental health crisis that the API community has also been dealing with, and a rise in gun ownership. So all of these things combined are a perfect storm. And so what happened, this week is, I don't believe it's the end. I think it's the beginning. And so I want all of us to be very vigilant in understanding our responsibility to address hate and make sure that we have support systems in place for our community. So I'd like to invite everyone to join me in adjourning in memory and in mourning of the victims of this tragic mass shooting in Monterey Park, Oakland, and Half Moon Bay. The scourge of gun violence has sadly hit home in San Mateo County. We are united in support with the communities who are stunned with grief. I want to thank all of the first responders and the heroes who intervened in their bravery in these shootings likely saved many lives. Our hearts go out to the communities everywhere dealing with this violence. So. Thank you.